Nobody warned her that today would be the day her entire life changed. Sarah had learned, in the 22 years she had spent invisible inside the walls of the Northern Royal Court, that warnings were a luxury reserved for people who mattered. She did not matter. She had never mattered. She was the girl who arrived before dawn and left after the last torch was extinguished, who carried the weight of hay bales and iron water buckets without complaint, who spoke to the animals in whispers and received their warmth in return, because warmth from living creatures was the only kind she had ever truly known. What she minded, on the rare occasions she allowed herself to mind anything at all, was the particular cruelty of being looked through rather than looked at, of existing in plain sight while remaining perfectly, utterly invisible to the world around her. That morning, however, something felt different. The air inside the royal stables carried a tension she could not name, the kind of tension that pressed against the skin and made the animals restless. The horses shifted in their stalls with more agitation than usual. Even old Bramble, the retired warhorse who had not spooked at anything in 6 years, was pressing his enormous gray head against the wooden slats of his stall and exhaling in short, sharp bursts. Sarah moved through the stable with practiced calm, her hands brushing against each animal as she passed, murmuring words that were not quite language and not quite song, but something that lived between the two. The horses settled wherever she walked. It had always been that way. She had stopped questioning it the way she had stopped questioning most things about herself, because questions without answers had a way of hollowing a person out if you let them. You. The voice came from behind her, sharp as a blade and twice as cold. Sarah turned to find Delmara, head of the royal household staff, standing at the entrance to the stable with her arms folded and her expression arranged into the particular geometry of displeasure she wore whenever she was forced to address anyone she considered beneath her, which was nearly everyone, but especially Sarah. The ceremony of dominion begins at midday. The Lord candidates arrive within the hour. I want this stable immaculate, and I want you out of sight the moment the first carriage passes through the gates. Do you understand me? Sarah understood. She always understood. She nodded once, kept her eyes appropriately lowered, and turned back to her work without a word, which was exactly the response Delmara expected, and therefore the safest one to give. The ceremony of dominion was something Sarah had heard about in fragments over the past several weeks, pieces of conversation she caught while passing through corridors and doorways, the kind of information that floated down through the hierarchy of a royal household like leaves falling from great heights. She had gathered that it was a test of some kind, a formal trial in which the men competing for the title of General of the North would prove their mastery and dominance over the most feared creature in the kingdom. Tempest. Even thinking the name sent a strange current through her chest, because Tempest was not simply a horse. Tempest was a legend, a force of nature wearing the shape of an animal, a black warhorse of such size and such fury that he had become, in the years since the king acquired him, less a creature and more a symbol. He was the physical embodiment of the North itself, untamable, unconquerable, absolute. Sarah had worked near Tempest for 2 years. She had never attempted to touch him. His stall was at the far end of the stable, separated from the others by 2 empty stalls on either side, because his presence alone made the nearest horses uneasy. The royal handlers approached him only when necessary, and only in pairs, and even then with ropes and protective gear, and the careful movements of men who understood they were in genuine danger. 3 handlers had been injured in the past year. One had broken his arm. Another had lost 2 fingers. The third had simply resigned the following morning and never returned. Tempest was not cruel in the way a creature with malicious intelligence might be cruel. He was something more elemental than that. He was rage and power and ancient autonomy given physical form, and he did not suffer weakness in any shape. Sarah, for reasons she had never examined too closely, found him beautiful. She did not approach him that morning. She had too much work to do, and besides, his stall was being prepared by the senior handlers for the ceremony, who were wrapping his legs in formal black bindings and arguing in low, stressed voices about whether the transport harness would hold if he decided to resist it. Sarah kept to her work and tried not to listen, and succeeded at neither, because Tempest's agitation was filling the stable like a rising tide, pressing against her awareness in a way that made the back of her neck prickle, and her hands clumsy on the rake she was using to clear the floor. By the time the first carriages arrived, she had retreated as instructed to the far corner of the stable yard, technically out of sight behind the feed storage building, but with a clear enough angle to see the courtyard where the ceremony would take place. She knew she should go inside. She knew that being caught watching was the kind of infraction that could cost her the position she had held for 4 years, the position that gave her a cot in the servants' quarters, and 1 meal a day, and the proximity to horses that was the closest thing to peace she had ever found. She stayed anyway. Some things pulled at a person with more force than caution. The men who arrived for the ceremony of dominion were exactly what she would have expected. They were large, broad-shouldered, armored in the ceremonial way that emphasized power without sacrificing elegance. Like in lords from across the northern territories, each one representing a bloodline of significance, each one radiating the particular brand of confident authority that came from having been told since birth that they were extraordinary. They gathered in the courtyard with the easy familiarity of men accustomed to being watched, greeting each other with handshakes and brief embraces, their voices carrying the low rumble of pack authority even in casual conversation. And then the king arrived, and the entire courtyard changed. Sarah had seen Caden Voss at a distance before. It was impossible to work within the royal grounds for 4 years, and never catch a glimpse of the man who ruled the northern territories, with an authority so complete and so unchallengeable that other kingdoms told stories about him, the way people told stories about storms. He was present in every corner of his kingdom, the way weather was present, not always visible, but always felt. His influence shaping the temperature and the pressure of everything around him. In person, at a distance of perhaps 40 feet, he was something that defied the comfortable categories she had built for him in her mind. She had imagined power as a loud thing. He was not loud. He stood at the entrance to the courtyard in formal dark armor with no ornamentation beyond the silver insignia of his rank, and the silence that spread from him through the assembled men was not the silence of fear, though fear was part of it. It was the silence of a room recognizing something at its center that was simply larger than everything else. He was not yet 30, she had heard. He had taken the throne at 19 after his father's death, under circumstances that people still discussed in whispers. He had consolidated the northern territories in 4 years through a combination of strategic brilliance and personal ferocity that had earned him the loyalty of every pack that mattered and the careful respect of every kingdom that bordered his. His hair was dark, his jaw hard, his eyes the particular gray of winter sky an hour before snow. He surveyed the assembled candidates with an expression that gave nothing away, and when he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the courtyard without being raised. "Today, one of you will either demonstrate the dominance required to lead my armies," he said, "or Tempest will demonstrate it for you. Either way, we will know what we need to know." There was brief, cautious laughter from the assembly. The king did not smile. "Begin. If you are enjoying this story, do not forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like this one." The first candidate was a lord from the Western Ridge, whose name Sarah did not know, a man who moved with the confidence of someone who had broken horses before and expected this to be no different. It was different. Tempest was led into the courtyard on 4 ropes, held by 6 handlers. And even then, even restrained and outnumbered, the animal's presence restructured the space around him. He was larger than Sarah had realized, seen from this angle in open air, rather than the dimness of the stable. His coat was the exact black of deep water at night, and the muscles moving beneath it were the muscles of something built, not for beauty, but for war, for endurance. for pure, overwhelming force. He moved with contained fury, each step deliberate, his head high, his dark eyes moving across the assembled. Humans with an expression that Sarah, perhaps foolishly, read as contempt. The first candidate lasted 11 seconds. The ropes were released. He approached. Tempest reared with a sound that was less a neigh and more a warning issued in a language older than words, and the man hit the ground hard enough that Sarah heard the impact from her hiding place. He rose to his credit and walked away under his own power, but he did not attempt a second approach. The second candidate lasted longer in the approach but shorter in the actual contact, because Tempest did not wait to be touched before communicating his opinion of the situation. The third managed to get a hand on the horse's flank, before being deposited onto the stones with a speed and efficiency that drew a collective intake of breath from the watching court. By the fourth attempt, the courtyard had taken on the particular atmosphere of a public humiliation that everyone was pretending was something more dignified, and the candidates, who had not yet tried, were watching Tempest with expressions that mixed determination with a visible recalculation of their own ambitions. It was during the sixth attempt, when a particularly large lord from the Eastern Territories was attempting to approach from the left side, while a handler distracted Tempest from the right, that things went wrong in a way that had not been anticipated. Tempest did not rear. He did not charge. He turned with a speed that no animal of his size should have. Possessed, snapped the lead rope nearest him with one violent toss of his head, and in the space of 3 seconds was no longer contained. He was free, and he was furious. The courtyard emptied with impressive speed. Lords and attendants and household staff scattered to the edges of the space, pressing against walls and ducking through doorways, and Tempest stood in the center of it all with his head high and his nostrils wide, and his hooves striking sparks from the stone with each shift of his weight, daring anything in his vicinity to be foolish enough to come closer. The remaining handlers had dropped their ropes and were doing the sensible thing, which was staying very still at the perimeter and hoping the animal would calm on his own. He did not appear to be calming on his own. His energy was building rather than dissipating, filling the courtyard like pressure before a storm. And Sarah, from her position behind the feed building, could feel it against her skin like heat from a fire. She did not make a decision. That was the honest truth of what happened next. The truth she would try to explain to herself, and fail for a long time afterward. She did not think. She did not weigh options. She did not calculate the risk against the reward. She simply moved. One moment she was behind the building, pressed against the wall with every sensible instinct she possessed, screaming at her to stay exactly where she was, and the next moment she was walking into the courtyard, into the wide open space that everyone else had vacated, moving toward the enormous, enraged animal that had just sent 6 trained handlers running for their lives. Someone said her name. She did not know who. She did not stop. The sound of the courtyard changed the moment she stepped into it. Not silence exactly, but a quality of attention that was different from the tense collective breath-holding of before. She could feel the weight of every eye in the space landing on her, but she did not look at any of them. She looked at Tempest, and Tempest, after a moment that lasted longer than time should have allowed, looked at her. She kept walking. She walked the way she always walked in the stable when an animal was frightened. Not slowly as a performance of calm, but with the actual rhythm of someone who was not afraid, because in that moment, she genuinely was not afraid. Something in her chest had opened like a window, and through it came the same awareness that she had spent 22 years, not examining too closely, the sense of the animal's emotions like weather patterns she could read without instruments, the particular texture of his fear and rage, and beneath both of those, buried so deep, she almost missed it, the aching loneliness of a creature that had never in its life been approached without the expectation of submission. "Easy," she said. She said it once, quietly, the way she said things in the stable. Not a command, not a plea, Just a word offered honestly, the way you would offer water to someone who was thirsty. Tempest's front hooves hit the ground. He was still trembling, still wild-eyed, the whites of his eyes visible and his chest heaving with the force of his contained energy. But he was not advancing. He was watching her with an intensity that she felt on her skin, a focus so complete it was almost physical. She stopped 3 feet from him. This was closer than any handler had come without ropes and assistance. She raised her hand slowly, palm up, fingers loose, offering without demanding. The same gesture she had used 1,000 times in the stable. The same gesture that always worked. Though she had never understood why, had never let herself look at the why too directly, because the shape of the answer frightened her. Tempest lowered his head. It was not a gradual lowering, not the slow capitulation of an animal cautiously deciding to trust. It was deliberate. It was complete. His massive head came down until his nose was level with her. Open palm and then lower still, until his forehead touched the stones of the courtyard and his front legs folded, and the northern war horse, the creature that had broken generals and humiliated princes and sent 6 trained handlers running, knelt in the silence of 100 watching people, and was still. Sarah stood with her hand resting gently on the warm black velvet of his nose, and tried to remember how to breathe. Around her, the courtyard was silent in a way that felt geological, like the silence inside a mountain. She could hear her own heartbeat. She could hear the wind moving through the pennants above the courtyard walls. She could hear, from somewhere behind her and to the right, the sound of someone exhaling a breath they had apparently been holding for quite some time. And then she made the mistake of looking up. She looked up because she needed to understand where she was and what had just happened. And when she looked up, her eyes found the king's eyes the way iron finds. A magnet, without intention, and without the possibility of resistance. He was standing perhaps 20 feet away, at the edge of the courtyard, where he had been watching the entire preceding disaster, with an expression that had been carefully unreadable throughout. It was no longer unreadable. She did not know what it was exactly, because she had no experience with the expressions of kings, and no framework for interpreting the particular quality of attention he was now directing at her. But she felt it like a hand pressed flat against her sternum, and she forgot, for one terrible and luminous moment, that she was supposed to be invisible. His eyes were gray. She had thought they would be hard, like stone. They were not hard. They were the gray of deep water, and they were looking at her with an intensity that made every other thing in the courtyard disappear. Then a voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Who is that girl?" It was a woman's voice, carrying the crystalline precision of someone accustomed to being heard in crowded rooms. Sarah broke eye contact with the king, and turned to find the source of the voice, and found Lady Isolde. She had heard of Isolde Crane the way everyone within the northern court had heard of her, through the kind of reverent and slightly fearful murmuring that attaches itself to beautiful, powerful women who are also dangerous. She was the daughter of the Southern Alpha Lord, positioned by 2 years of careful political maneuvering, as the future queen of the North, and she was standing at the edge of the courtyard in deep blue formal robes, with her dark hair arranged in the style of a woman who understood that appearance was its own form of power. She was extraordinary to look at. She was also looking at Sarah with the particular expression of someone who had just identified a problem. "A stable girl," said Delmara, appearing at Isolde's side with the speed of someone who understood the function they were serving. "She works in the stables. She should not be here. I apologize for this disruption." Delmara's voice had the quality of a blade being drawn, and it was directed entirely at Sarah, who felt the familiar weight of invisibility being pressed back down on her like a lid. "Return to your station immediately." Sarah nodded. She dropped her hand from Tempest's nose and turned to go. She had taken 2 steps when the king's voice stopped her. "Wait." The word was not loud. It did not need to be. It carried the same quality as the rest of him, the quality of something that simply was, without needing to announce itself or justify its existence. Sarah stopped. She turned back, because there was nothing else to do. Because a person did not keep walking when the Alpha King of the North said wait. She turned back and found him looking at her still. The same quality of attention, undiminished by the 30 seconds that had passed. "What is your name?" he said. It was not a question. It was the gathering of information, stated rather than asked, which was how she imagined kings spoke when they wanted things. "Sarah," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "My name is Sarah." He looked at her for 3 more seconds. In those 3 seconds, she became aware of every inadequacy of her appearance. The hay in her hair, the dirt on her hands, the stable smell that clung to her clothing. The absolute contrast she presented to every other person currently standing in this courtyard. None of it appeared to register in his expression. He was looking at her the way Tempest had looked at her, like a question he had not yet decided to ask aloud. "Do not go far," he said finally. And then he turned away, back to his advisors, back to the organized world of a king's concerns, and Sarah was dismissed in the way that only kings could dismiss a person, with such completeness that the air itself seemed to close over the space where his attention had been. She went back to the stable. She sat in the hay outside Bramble's stall and pressed her hands flat against her thighs and tried to understand what had just happened. She could not. She sat there for a very long time, listening to the sounds of the ceremony being concluded in the courtyard outside and the distant conversation of men deciding significant things, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, she became aware that something had shifted inside her, some internal arrangement of certainty and resignation that she had maintained for as long as she could remember, and that it had shifted in a direction she could not name, but could feel in her bones, like the approach of a storm. What do you think will happen next? Leave your predictions in the comments below. The summons came that evening, delivered by a stone-faced palace attendant, who stood in the stable doorway with the expression of a man who could not quite believe he had been sent on this particular errand. Sarah was to attend the king in the eastern study. At the 7th bell. She was to come as she was. She was not to be late. The attendant departed without waiting for a response, apparently considering her compliance too obvious to require confirmation. She went, because what else could she do? She washed her hands and face at the stable trough, and did what she could with her hair, and wore the cleanest version of her stable clothing, and walked through corridors she had only ever seen from the servants' peripheral routes into a part of the palace she had never entered. The eastern study smelled of wood polish and old paper, and something underneath both of those things that she recognized, distantly and with a shock she could not suppress, as the same thing she had smelled on the wind during full moons. The thing that called to something inside her chest and made her bones ache with a longing she had no words for. The king was alone. She had expected attendants, advisors, some institutional buffer between herself and the weight of this conversation. There was none of that. He was seated at a long wooden table covered in maps and documents, his armor replaced by simpler dark clothing that made him look, if possible, more himself, less ceremonial and more essential. He looked up when she entered, and the quality of his attention settled on her again, with that same particular gravity. And she stood in the doorway and tried to look like someone who was not completely undone by the past 8 hours of her life. "Close the door," they said. She did. "Sit." There was a chair across the table from him. She sat. He studied her for a moment with his hands flat on the table and his expression doing that thing it did where it revealed nothing but somehow communicated everything. And then he said, "Where did you learn to handle animals that way?" Again, not a question. He spoke the way he moved, with the efficiency of someone who had no patience for the decorative excess of language. "I did not learn it," she said, and then stopped. because admitting things you did not understand to the most powerful man in the Northern Territories felt deeply inadvisable. He waited. She had the sense that he was very good at waiting, that he had the patience of terrain rather than the patience of a person, something that simply endured without effort. "It has always been that way," she said finally. "With animals. They respond to me. I do not know why." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How long have you been in the royal stables?" 4 years. Before that. She hesitated. The outer villages. I was in the service of a horse trader in Merrick Township before I came here. And before Merrick. She met his eyes. I do not remember much before Merrick. This was true, and it was also the most frightening truth she carried, because the absence of her own history had always felt less like forgetting, and more like having something hidden from her, a door that was locked from the outside. His eyes sharpened slightly at her. Answer. A barely perceptible shift. But she was watching him closely enough to catch it. "How old are you?" 22, she said. "As far as I know." He leaned back in his chair, and the quality of his attention changed again, from investigation to something she could not categorize, something that moved along her skin like the pressure change before lightning struck. "You are not afraid of me," he said. It was not an accusation. It was an observation, delivered with the mild surprise of a man who encountered this rarely enough to find it notable. "I am trying very hard to be," she said, and it came out more honestly than she had intended, slipping past her defenses the way truth sometimes did when you were too tired to maintain them. Something moved across his face. She would have called it amusement if she had believed he was capable of it in this context. "You should be," he said. "You walked into a courtyard with a loose war horse that has put 6 trained handlers in the healing ward this year alone." "I know," she said. "He was frightened." There was a pause. "He was not frightened," the king said. "He was furious." "Those are not different things," she said. "Not usually." Another silence, longer this time, and she felt the weight of it pressing on her the way the stable felt before a thunderstorm, and she gripped the edge of her chair and did not look away from him, because she had the instinctive certainty that looking away would be the wrong thing to do. "You will continue working in the stables," he said, "but you will also work with Tempest. Specifically with Tempest. The handlers will be informed." She stared at him. "I am a stable girl," she said. "Yes," he said. "And you are the only person in my kingdom that animal has not attempted to destroy. That makes you useful to me. Is that a problem?" It was not a question. None of the things he said were really questions. "No," she said. "It is not a problem." "Good." He looked back at his maps. "You may go." She rose from the chair and walked to the door and had her hand on the latch before he spoke again, and his voice was different this time, quieter, stripped of its official quality, the way a sound changes when you remove the room it was built for. "Sarah." She turned. He was not looking at her. He was looking at his maps. "What you did today required either remarkable courage or remarkable foolishness." He paused. "I have not yet decided which." She opened the door. "Neither have I," she said, and left. She walked back to the stables in the dark and sat with Bramble for a very long time and tried to slow down her heartbeat, and mostly failed, because something inside her was moving that had been still for her entire life. Something turning in the dark like a key in a lock she had not known was there. Lady Isolde came to the stables 2 days later. Sarah had not expected this. In the hierarchy of the Northern Court, a woman of Isolde's position did not visit the stables, not in person, not without a specific equestrian purpose, and Lady Isolde did not appear to have come for equestrian purposes. She came in the mid-morning with 2 attendants who positioned themselves at the entrance, while Isolde herself moved through the stable with the careful grace of someone navigating terrain they considered beneath them, but were too composed to show distaste for. She found Sarah near Tempest's stall, where Sarah had spent an increasing amount of the past 48 hours, learning. The particular frequency of his moods, the way his ears moved before he decided something, the scent that rolled off him when he was calm versus when he was building towards something explosive. "You are the stable girl," Isolde said. Not a greeting, a placement. She was even more extraordinary up close, the kind of beautiful that had clearly been curated and maintained with the discipline of a military campaign. And her eyes were dark and sharply intelligent, and currently doing to Sarah what a skilled hunter's eyes did to a landscape, identifying threats and calculating distances. "Sarah," Sarah said. "My name is Sarah." "I know your name," Isolde said pleasantly. "The king told me he has given you a special assignment." She paused beside the empty stall adjacent to Tempest's, trailing one gloved finger along the wood, and the gesture was casual in the way that extremely deliberate things were sometimes casual. "I wanted to see you for myself, to understand what he saw." Sarah stood very still. Everything in her chest was alert, in the way it was alert before weather. "I am simply a stable worker," she said. "I have a certain ability with animals. The king found it useful." "Yes," Isolde said. She turned to look at Sarah directly, and her smile was the most polished thing Sarah had ever seen, a perfect construction, with nothing behind it that Sarah could read. "He finds useful things useful. That is one of his better qualities." She came a step closer. "But useful things have a way of outlasting their usefulness. You understand what I mean?" It was phrased as a question, but it was not a question. Sarah was beginning to recognize that quality in the speech of powerful people. "I understand perfectly," Sarah said. Isolde's smile did not change. "Good," she said. "I am glad we understand each other." She turned to go, moving with that liquid grace back toward the entrance. At the doorway she paused and looked back once, and the look was the final thing. The thing underneath. The smile, just briefly visible before she composed it away. "Be careful with Tempest," she said. "Animals are unpredictable." She left. Sarah stood in the stable and listened to her own breathing, and the soft sounds of Tempest moving in his stall, and felt the particular cold of a threat that was too elegant to ever be proven. Over the following 2 weeks, Sarah's world rearranged itself in ways she had no architecture for. Her mornings still began before dawn, but they ended at Tempest's stall, rather than distributed across the stable's general needs. The senior handlers observed her work with expressions ranging from skepticism to something approaching awe, because Tempest under Sarah's presence was not the same animal he was under anyone else's. He was not tame. She never made the mistake of thinking him tame. But he was present with her in a way he was not present with anyone else, attending to her movements with an intelligence that made every handler who witnessed it slightly uncomfortable. She learned his rhythms. She learned that he was calmer in the morning than the afternoon, that he was more restless on the days preceding the full moon, that he had a particular response to thunderstorms that was not fear, but something more complex. She learned that he would accept a bridle from her hands, where he would destroy one attempted by anyone else. She learned, on a cool morning in the 2nd week, that when she pressed her forehead against his, the buzzing thing in her chest that had been growing since the day in the courtyard resonated in a way that was almost painful with its fullness, and Tempest exhaled a breath that felt like an answer. She saw the king 6 times in those 2 weeks. Not by arrangement. The palace was large, but it was not infinite, and a man who moved through it with the purposeful frequency that Caden Voss did would inevitably cross paths with a woman who was now spending her days in his stables. The first 3 encounters were brief. Functional, him passing through the stable yard with his war council, her pressing herself against the wall in the posture of appropriate invisibility. The 4th was different. He had come alone to check on Tempest, and he had found Sarah sitting in the open doorway of Tempest's stall, with her back against the frame and her eyes closed and her hand resting on the floor of the stall where Tempest stood with his nose inches from her hair. She heard him approach and opened her eyes and found him, standing in the wide corridor of the stable with his hands at his sides and his expression doing that thing where it was blank and full at the same time. "He sleeps when you are here," he said. She looked at Tempest, who was not sleeping precisely, but whose eyes were half closed, and whose weight was distributed in the particular way of an animal at rest. "He trusts me," she said. "Yes," he said. He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet, like weather pausing. "That is not something he does." "No," she agreed. He looked at her for 3 more seconds. Then, unexpectedly, "Are you well? In this position, the other staff, do they treat you appropriately?" She blinked. "Yes," she said, which was mostly true. "The work suits me." He nodded once. "Good." He turned to go, then paused without turning back and said, "The winter ceremony is in 3 weeks. There will be additional staff requirements. If you need anything, tell the head handler." He left. She sat in the stable doorway, for a long time afterward, listening to Tempest breathe, and told herself firmly that the warmth in her chest was nothing. It was nothing. She was a stable girl, and he was a king. And the distance between those two things was not a distance, but a different kind of world entirely. And she had been surviving perfectly well in her own world for 22 years, and she would continue to do so. She was a very unconvincing liar. She had always known this about herself. If you want to see how this story ends, make sure you are subscribed with notifications on. The winter ceremony was the most significant event in the Northern Court's annual calendar, the moment when the political and social architecture of the kingdom displayed itself in its full formal glory, and alliances were declared and strengthened and occasionally undermined with the elegant brutality of people who had learned to use ceremony as a weapon. It was also, Sarah gathered from conversations that leaked through the palace, walls to the stable-yard, the event at which King Caden was expected to formally announce his intention to claim Lady Isolde as his mate. The political necessity of this had been arranged over 2 years of negotiation. The South and the North needed the alliance. The formal claiming ceremony would follow at the spring equinox, but the winter ceremony announcement was the public commitment that would set everything in motion. Sarah heard this information on a Tuesday and spent the rest of the week being extremely sensible about it. She told herself that it changed nothing, because it changed nothing. She told herself that the warmth she felt in the king's presence was a perfectly understandable but completely inadvisable response to proximity to a powerful individual, and that it would pass once the announcement was made and formalized in the way that only public declarations could formalize things. She told herself all of this with great frequency and conviction, and she almost believed it, except that on Thursday evening, Tempest pressed his nose against her shoulder and exhaled in a way that felt uncomfortably like comfort, and she had to sit down in the hay and breathe slowly for several minutes before she could go on. The 5th encounter with the king happened on the Friday before the ceremony. She was working late, the stable quiet and gold with lamplight. She heard his footsteps before she saw him, had learned the particular rhythm of the way he moved, and she was already bracing herself when he appeared in the stable entrance. He was alone again. He came down the center of the stable without the acknowledgement of purpose that usually accompanied his movements, which was unusual enough that she straightened from the water bucket she was filling, and gave him her full attention. He stopped outside Tempest's stall, and looked at the horse for a long moment, and Tempest made no sound, and no threatening gesture, but simply regarded the king, the way a mountain regards. Weather passing through, elemental and unhurried. "He tolerates me," Caden said. "More than he once did. I believe you have something to do with that." "I have not done anything deliberately," Sarah said. He turned to look at her, and the directness of it was something she was not accustomed to. The way his full attention felt like sunlight concentrated through glass. "No," he said. "I do not think you do most of it deliberately." In the quiet, the stable wrapped around them with its intimacy of warm animal breath and lamp gold light. "The ceremony is in 4 days," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at her steadily. "I wanted you to know," he said, and then stopped. He looked away from her, back at Tempest, and when he continued, his voice had a quality she had not heard in it before, something stripped of its official register. "The announcement at the winter ceremony. It is politically necessary. That is the sum of it. I am telling you this because you deserve to hear it stated." Plainly, "Why are you telling me this?" she said. He met her eyes. "Because you are the only person in this palace," he said carefully, "to whom it seemed important to say." He left before she could respond, and she stood holding her water bucket with her heart making a sound against her ribs like something trying to get out, and Tempest pressed his nose against the bars of his stall and breathed warm air against her face, and she pressed her forehead against his and tried to understand what had just happened and failed completely. She did not sleep that night. She lay in her narrow cot and stared at the ceiling and ran through the conversation with the analytical precision of someone trying to decode a language they had only just learned existed. He had told her. He had come to the stable, alone, at night, to tell her specifically that the announcement was political, and not of the heart. She turned this over and over and could not find an interpretation that was safe. Could not find the interpretation that let her remain in the comfortable geography of her own invisibility, and by the time the pre-dawn gray was pressing against the small window of her room, she had arrived at the conclusion that she was in serious trouble. The night before the winter ceremony, she was woken by pain. She had experienced the ache before, the deep bone resonance that came on the nights of the full moon, the sensation of something inside her pressing against its own boundaries the way a river pressed against ice in the first warmth of spring. But this was not the full moon, which was still 5 days away, and the pain was different this time, more specific, more directed, concentrated in a line down her spine and spreading outward through her limbs like fire following channels carved into stone. She curled around it in her cot and breathed through it and told herself it would pass the way it always passed. It did not pass. It grew, steadily and with terrible patience, until she could no longer stay in the cot, and she pushed herself upright and wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and walked, because walking had always helped, through the dark corridors of the servants' wing and out into the stable yard. The night air stopped the worst of it, or rather, changed its quality. Outside, under the sky with its mass of winter stars, the sensation in her bones became less like pain and more like recognition, like the feeling of hearing a piece of music that you had known as a child and forgotten and suddenly encountered again. She stood in the stable yard with her eyes closed and her arms wrapped around herself and breathed, and with each breath, something inside her was aligning, clicking into position like the tumblers of a very old lock responding to a key it had been waiting a very long time for. Then she heard the sound. Low, sustained, resonant in a frequency that bypassed her ears entirely and hit something in her chest that she had no name for. A howl, but not an ordinary howl. Something ancient and formal and addressed. She understood with a certainty that had nothing to do with reason, to her specifically. Her eyes opened. Her hands had dropped to her sides. The cold of the night air was irrelevant. The thing in her chest was turning and turning, and the sound of the howl was fading, but its resonance was not. It was spreading through her like light through water, and the mark appeared without warning or ceremony on the inside of her left wrist. Silver white and precise, as if drawn by a hand that had known exactly where it was going. She stared at it. She had seen this before, in descriptions, in the whispered conversation of pack members who had found their destined mates. The mate mark. The seal of the bond that the ancient magic of their kind placed on those who were fated, those whose wolves had recognized each other across whatever distance separated them and reached through the world to say yes. This one has always been meant for you. She was shaking. She pressed her marked wrist against her heart and stood in the dark of the stable yard and tried to understand what this meant, and the understanding came in pieces, each one more staggering than the last. She was a lichen. She had always been a lichen, had always carried the wolf in her blood without knowing it. The wolf that had been sleeping for 22 years behind whatever wall had been built to contain it. And now the wall was cracking. And the reason the wall was cracking was standing somewhere in the palace at this moment, wearing a mate mark that matched her own. She knew this the way she knew everything she knew about animals, not through logic, but through the deeper knowing, the knowing of blood and bone and ancient inheritance. The king, Caden Voss, the Alpha King of the North, he was her mate. She sat down on the stones of the stable yard, because there was nothing else to do. The cold of the stone was clarifying. She sat with her back against the stable wall and her marked wrist pressed against her chest and her head tipped back to look at the winter stars, and she did the only thing available to her in that moment, which was breathe, slowly and steadily, until the shaking stopped and the cold became a presence rather than a sensation, and she could begin, very carefully, to think. She was a stable girl with no memory of her past and no family she could name. Tomorrow, he would stand before his court and announce his political intention to claim Lady Isolde. And somewhere between these two facts was a truth that was so large and so impossible that she could not see its edges, could only see that it existed, and that it was going to change everything. Whether she was ready for that or not, she was in the stable before dawn. She was always in the stable before dawn. But this morning she went first to Tempest's stall, and Tempest was already awake, already watching the stable entrance with an alertness that told her he had known she was coming before she arrived, and when she pressed her marked wrist against his nose, he inhaled deeply, and then made a sound she had never heard from him, low and resonant, and somehow satisfied, as if a question that had been troubling him for some time had been resolved. "You knew," she said. "You knew all along." He huffed warm air against her palm. "Thank you," she said, though she was not entirely sure what she was thanking him for. Perhaps for kneeling. Perhaps for being the beginning of all of this. Perhaps simply for being present, warm and solid and real, in a world that was suddenly far less solid than she had believed. She was still in the stable 3 hours later, when Lord Fenwick found her. He was an elder of the Northern Pack, one of the highest-ranked members of the King's Inner Council, a man whose age had settled into his face as gravity and authority. She knew him by sight, had seen him in the courtyard during the ceremony of dominion. He came to her, stall with the deliberate step of someone who had decided something, and he looked at her with eyes that held the quality of a person recognizing something they had been looking for a very long time. "Show me your wrist," he said. She pulled her sleeve back without asking why, because she already knew. He looked at the mark for a long time, his expression doing something complex that mixed the profound satisfaction of a conclusion with the complicated grief of a long secret finally released. "I need you to come with me," he said. "There are things you need to know before tonight, things that should have been told to you a very long time ago." She looked at him steadily. "Who am I?" she said. He met her eyes. "You are Sarah Voss," he said, "daughter of the late King Aldrich of the North, the king's own blood, hidden when you were an infant to protect you from the coup that killed your father, and the true heir to a bloodline more ancient and more powerful than anything the Northern Court has seen in 4 generations. The silence that followed was the kind that changes things permanently, the kind that exists between the moment before a thing is known and the moment after. And Sarah stood in it with her hand on Tempest's nose and her marked wrist pressed to her chest and let the enormity of it settle into her bones like the cold of the stone courtyard had settled the night before, slowly and completely, and without the possibility of being unfelt. "Tell me everything," she said. And Lord Fenwick told her. Her father, Aldrich Voss, had been the king before Caden's father, a great and beloved ruler who had died not of illness as the official histories recorded, but of a conspiracy organized by the men who wished to control the succession and found a child queen inconvenient to their purposes. Sarah had been 3 months old. Her mother, the queen, had died in the same night. 2 servants loyal to her father had taken Sarah from the palace and carried her north, to the outer villages, erasing every trace of her existence, building a new history over the old one, with the kind of thoroughness that was only possible when the people constructing the lie were motivated by genuine devotion. The memory suppressants she had been given as a child had done their work too well. They had not merely erased her memories. They had also suppressed her wolf, had kept it sleeping below the surface of her consciousness for 22 years, while the ancient blood of her lineage waited, with the patience of stone for the moment when the suppression would weaken enough for the truth to begin pressing through. That moment was now. The mate mark was proof. The ancient magic of the pack recognized bloodlines in a way that human conspiracy could not override. And her wolf had recognized its mate, and in doing so had finally broken through the surface of all that careful, deliberate forgetting. "Caden," she said. Lord Fenwick nodded. "He found his mark last night," the elder said. "I was with him. He did not understand it at first. He has been trying to find its source since before dawn. He does not know who I am," she said. "No," Fenwick said. "Not yet." She looked at the mark on her wrist. She thought about the winter ceremony beginning in 7 hours. She thought about Lady Isolde's smile in the stable and the threat beneath it. She thought about the king standing in the lamplight, telling her that the announcement was political and not of the heart. And she thought about what it meant that he had felt the need to say that to her specifically, before he knew about the mark, before he knew about any of this. "Tonight," she said. "Can it wait until tonight?" Fenwick looked at her for a long time. "The announcement," he said. "If you wait until tonight, he may make the announcement before you can reach him." "Yes," she said. She had thought about this. "But if I tell him now, privately, before the ceremony, it changes the nature of what happens. It becomes something done in a back room. Something that can be denied or delayed or managed by people with political interests in a different outcome." She looked at Fenwick steadily. "If it happens tonight, in the ceremony, in front of the court, there is no managing it." Fenwick was quiet for a very long time. Then he said, "Your father was exactly like this, direct as a blade and twice as unsettling." Something moved through her chest at those words, something warm and ancient and sorrowful. "Teach me what I need to know," she said. "Before tonight. Teach me everything." He taught her. For 4 hours in a small room off the stable yard, Lord Fenwick taught her the forms and the language and the traditions of her bloodline, the specific protocol of the ancient claim, the words that had to be spoken and the way they had to be spoken and what they meant in the legal and magical architecture of pack law. He taught her that a mate bond once marked could not be dissolved by political agreement, that it superseded any other claimed relationship, that it was recognized by the ancient law of the pack as binding in a way that no human ceremony could override. He taught her that her father's bloodline carried specific gifts, the gifts she had always had and never named, the communication with animals, the ability to move through pack emotional currents the way some people read weather, and a gift she did not yet have access to, but that he believed was still to come. The gift of the alphas. Call, the ability to reach into a pack's collective wolf and speak to it directly, bypassing the individual and addressing the blood. "You have not fully shifted," she said. "No," Fenwick said. "The suppressants held the wolf back for too long. The shift is coming, but your body needs time to process what has been released. It may come tonight. It may come later. But when it comes, it will be complete." He looked at her with the expression of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and was close to being able to set it down. "Your father trusted me to protect you," he said. "I did what I could. I am sorry it was not more." She reached across and touched his hand briefly, offering something without demanding anything in return. "You kept me alive," she said. That was everything. The winter ceremony began at sundown. The great hall of the Northern Palace was the largest interior space in the kingdom, and on ceremony nights it became something between a court and a stage, every surface illuminated with the cold white light of 100 silver lamps. Every member of the northern nobility and their allies arranged in the formal semicircle of acknowledgement that the ceremony protocol required. Sarah had never been inside the great hall. She stood at the servants' entrance, which Fenwick had helped her access, and looked at the assembled court, and felt the particular sensation of standing at the edge of a very significant thing. She was not dressed as a stable girl. Fenwick had arranged clothing, simple but correct. A formal dress in the deep blue of the northern bloodline, a color that would mean something to everyone in that room who knew the old traditions, which was everyone who was old enough to remember. She had washed and arranged her hair, and she had the mark visible on her wrist, uncovered, because covering it now would have been a lie she was done telling. She looked, she thought, exactly like what she was. Whether that was a comfort or a terror, she had not yet decided. The ceremony had been in progress for perhaps 20 minutes when she moved. She had timed it carefully, listening to the formal announcements, tracking the progression toward the moment when the king would rise to address the court on the matter of the political alliance. When she heard the shift in the ceremony's cadence that told her that moment was approaching, she walked in through the servants' entrance and continued walking toward the center of the hall, and the court parted around her, the way water parts around something placed in its current, with a ripple of awareness spreading outward from her presence that she felt on her skin. She stopped in the center of the hall. The king had risen from his formal seat. Lady Isolde was seated to his right in the position of the declared intended, and her expression when she saw Sarah was the first genuinely unguarded thing Sarah had ever seen on her face, a flash of pure fury before the composure reinstalled itself, and the smile returned, and only the darkness in her eyes remained to tell the truth of what was underneath. The king was looking at Sarah. He had been looking at her from the moment she entered the hall, she understood, because she had been feeling his attention on her skin the whole length of her walk from the entrance. He was not speaking. The formal words he had risen to say had simply stopped, held in abeyance by the sight of her in the center of his court, in the color of his bloodline with the mark visible on her wrist. "Your Majesty," she said. Her voice carried through the hall with more force than she had intended, but perhaps that was right. Perhaps she was done with being quiet. "I must speak by the right of the ancient claim. I invoke the law of the mate bond, which supersedes political arrangement and stands above the authority of any agreement made without acknowledgement of its presence." The hall was absolutely silent. She raised her marked wrist. "I carry your mark," she said. "Placed last night by the ancient law of our kind. I do not come here to disrupt. I come here because silence would be a lie, and I am done with lies." She met his eyes across the length of the hall. His expression was the one she could not read, the one that was blank and full at the same time, and his gray eyes were on her with the force of weather. Lord Fenwick's voice came from the side of the hall, formal and carrying the weight of his rank and age. "I bear witness to the identity of this woman. She is Sarah Voss, daughter of the late King Aldrich, of the direct bloodline of the North, hidden at birth for her protection, alive, present, and marked." The murmur that moved through the court was not a murmur, but a tide. Sarah kept her eyes on the king. She did not watch the court. She watched him, because he was the only thing in the room that mattered in this specific moment. the only thing the outcome depended on, the only thing that could make the next several minutes survivable or unsurvivable. He stepped down from the formal dais. He walked toward her through the center of the hall, through the silent, watching court, through the space that the assembled nobles were making for him, with the careful instinct of people recognizing something significant happening at the center of the world they inhabited. He walked until he was standing before her, close enough that she could see the detail of his face, the exact gray of his eyes, the set of his jaw, the particular quality of his expression that she had learned over weeks of careful observation and still could not fully decode. He raised his right hand. He turned it palm up. On the inside of his wrist, matching hers with the precision of something made rather than happened, was the mark. "When?" he said. His voice was very quiet, intended for her alone. "Last night," she said, "in the stable yard." He was looking at the mark on her wrist, and then at her face, and then at the mark again, and something was happening in his expression that she had not seen there before. Something being released that had been held very tightly. Something that changed the quality of his stillness from the stillness of control to the stillness of arrival. "I felt it," he said. "I have been looking for it since before dawn." "I know," she said. "Fenwick told me." He looked at her for a long moment, and the question he had been circling since the first day in the courtyard was in his eyes. The question of who she was, and what she was, and how something like her had been standing in his stable yard for 4 years, while he governed a kingdom, without knowing that the missing piece of his bloodline was 40 feet from where he slept. "You were in the stables," he said. "For 4 years." "Yes," she said. He exhaled, a single breath that had the quality of something enormous being processed in real time. Then he did something she had not anticipated. He took her marked wrist in his hands, both of his hands, with the gentleness that surprised her every time she encountered it in him, because it was so completely at odds with the rest of what he presented to the world. And he bent his head and pressed his lips to the mark. The hall was silent enough that she thought she might actually hear the moment itself, hear the particular note it produced, the resonance of something ancient being acknowledged and accepted and confirmed. She felt it through her entire body, the confirmation of the bond, like a chord resolving after a very long time in dissonance. Her wolf, pressed so long against the inside of whatever wall had contained it, surged in her chest with a heat and a force that she understood in that moment was the beginning of its return, the first real motion of something that had been sleeping for 22 years, finally moving toward the surface. Her eyes filled without her permission, which was mortifying, and she blinked hard and kept them where they belonged. He raised his head and looked at her, and his eyes were the deep gray of winter sky, and they were warm. "Sarah Voss," he said, in a voice that was entirely his own, stripped of its king voice and its official register, carrying only the truth of the man beneath the crown. "My mate." The word hit her in the chest like something thrown from a great distance, and arriving with all the force of its journey intact. She pressed her lips together, and kept her voice steady with the effort of someone who had been keeping things steady for 22 years, and was very good at it, even when the thing being kept steady was enormous and difficult, and the most significant of her life. "My king," she said. Lady Isolde's voice cut across the hall, sharp and controlled, and carrying the full weight of every political arrangement that was currently in the process of being restructured around events she had not anticipated. "This is a fabrication," she said. She rose from her seat, with the dignity of someone who had decided that composure was the only remaining territory she could defend. A stable girl appears on the night of the ceremony, with a claim of bloodline, and a mark that has been convenient enough to appear at the most convenient possible moment. The court should not be moved by spectacle. Caden's attention shifted from Sarah to Isolde, and Sarah watched the shift and understood what it meant. Understood that this was the moment the balance tipped, the moment the King's response defined everything that followed. He looked at Isolde for a long moment, with an expression that was completely unreadable to everyone in the hall except, Sarah realized slowly, herself. She could read it now. She could read him, the way she read animals, through the ancient connection that had been building and had now arrived at completion. He was not angry. He was resolved. "Lord Fenwick," he said, without raising his voice. "Confirm." Fenwick stepped forward from the side of the hall with the composed authority of an elder who has been waiting a very long time to do exactly this. "The bloodline is confirmed through the ancient records held by the pack elders," he said. "The mark is genuine. I have witnessed the mark on both parties. The mate bond is established under the law of our kind, and under that law it supersedes any arrangement made in its absence." He paused. "Lady Isolde, the Southern Alliance was made in good faith, and the North will honor the spirit of that alliance through other means. But a king who ignores a true mate bond to serve political convenience is a king who breaks the deepest law of our kind. No elder council in the North or the South would require it of him." Isolde looked at Fenwick for a long moment. Then she looked at Sarah with the expression of someone adjusting their map to account for terrain they had not previously recognized as significant. The smile she produced was different from the one Sarah had seen before. This one had something real in it, though what that real thing was, Sarah could not determine. "Then I withdraw my suit," she said quietly, "and wish the king and his true mate well." She sat down. The hall breathed. Caden turned back to Sarah. He was standing very close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, could feel the mate bond resonating between them like a string drawn taut, vibrating with everything that had not yet been said, and would take considerably more time and considerably more privacy to properly address. "The ceremony," she said quietly. "I have completely disrupted your ceremony." "Yes," he said. Something in his voice told her he was not distressed by this. "You are also making every person in this hall look at you, which I suspect you are aware of, and are tolerating rather than enjoying." "I am tolerating it," she confirmed, "at considerable personal cost." He almost smiled. She saw it at the very edge of his expression, almost there, and then contained, but it was there. "Then let me be brief," he said, and turned to address the court with the authority of his full formal register, the voice that filled rooms without effort. "The court bears witness to the mate bond between the Alpha King of the North and Sarah Voss, of the bloodline of Aldrich, of the blood of the North. By ancient law and by my own will, she is confirmed as my true mate. The formal claiming ceremony will take place at the winter solstice, 14 days hence. All present are witnesses." He turned back to her. "Is that sufficient?" he said quietly. "For tonight." "Yes," she said. He offered her his arm. She took it, because this was apparently the kind of thing that happened now, the kind of thing that was real and true, and part of her life, this extraordinary and impossible life that had been hers all along, and that she was only now beginning to understand the shape of. She took his arm and walked with him through the silent, watching court, and the wolves felt it in their blood. Every pack member in that hall feeling the resonance of the bond, the way wolves felt the moon, instinctively and completely, and one by one they inclined their heads, and the acknowledgement moved through the court like a tide, and Sarah, who had spent 22 years being invisible, walked through the center of the world she had always been meant to inhabit, and let herself be seen. The solstice ceremony was 14 days away. In those 14 days, Sarah learned what it meant to be claimed and to claim in return, in the language of the pack and the law of their kind, and the private architecture of two people learning the specific geography of each other. She was given rooms in the royal wing, which she found overwhelming, and kept leaving to return to the stables, which the king accepted with the composure of a man adjusting his expectations without making it a negotiation. "You do not have to stop working with the horses," he said, on the third day, finding her in Tempest's stall before dawn, as he had developed the habit of doing. "I would not ask that of you." She looked at him. "I know you would not," she said. "That is one of the more extraordinary things about you." He was quiet for a moment in the lamplight, and then he crossed the remaining distance between them with the deliberate step of a man who had decided something, and he cupped her face in both hands, and he kissed her, and it was nothing like what she had imagined, and everything like what she had always, without knowing it, been waiting for. The wolf came fully to the surface 2 nights before the solstice ceremony, and it was nothing like pain, and nothing like the ache she had known all her life, and everything like breathing for the first time. She was in the courtyard when it happened, under the winter stars, and Caden was with her because he was almost always with her now. And when the shift took her, she did not fight it, and it did not hurt. She came through it in the form she had always been, always underneath everything. A wolf, the color of winter smoke, silver gray and large, larger than she had expected, larger than she had expected. She stood in the courtyard and looked up at Caden with her wolf's eyes, and he shifted beside her in a form that was black as tempest at midnight, enormous and absolute, the Alpha King in his true shape, and they ran together through the winter grounds of the northern palace under the stars, and it was the most completely herself she had ever felt in her entire life. The solstice ceremony was everything that the court expected of a formal claiming, and nothing at all like what Sarah had imagined. She had imagined it with dread, another public scrutiny, another room full of watching eyes, another performance of a self she was still learning. It was not that. It was fire and moonlight, and ancient words spoken in the language of the pack that resonated in her blood, the way music resonated in bone. And it was Caden's voice saying the words of the claim in the register that was only ever his own, stripped of the king and leaving the man. And it was her own voice answering, steadier than she had any right to expect. And it was Tempest in the stable yard beyond the ceremony grounds, visible through the open gate, standing with his head raised and his dark eyes watching, as if he wanted to witness the conclusion of the thing he had begun. When it was done, when the words were spoken and the seal of the bond was set in the ancient law of their kind, Caden pulled her close in the firelight, with his hands in her hair and his forehead against hers, in the gesture she had always used with animals, and had never used with a person until him, and she felt the bond complete itself, with a resonance that moved through her from her marked wrist to the center of her chest, and outward to her wolf and back again, a circuit closing, a door opening that had been locked from the outside for 22 years, and the rightness of it was so complete and so overwhelming that she pressed her face against his chest and simply breathed it in. Breathed in the warmth and the reality and the extraordinary ordinary truth of being exactly where she had always been meant to be. 22 years, she said, against the fabric of his formal clothing. We lost 22 years. He tightened his arms around her. We have considerably more than that ahead of us, he said. She lifted her head and looked at him in the firelight. This man who had been her king before he was her mate, and who was both now, and who had spent weeks looking at her with that full attention that she now understood had always been his wolf, recognizing something his mind had not yet been allowed to name. Yes, she said. We do. He kissed her again in the firelight in front of the watching court, and nobody looked away, because there was nothing else worth watching. In the stable afterward, when the ceremony was concluded, and the court had dispersed and the night was quiet, Sarah sat with Tempest one more time in the way she had always sat with him, her forehead against his, her hand on the warm velvet of his nose, the bond between them humming at a frequency she had always felt, and only now understood. She had come to the stables because this was where everything had begun, because the horse that threw every rider had knelt for her, and in kneeling had been the first truth that the world could not ignore, the first crack in the wall of her invisibility, the beginning of the avalanche of revelation that had brought her here, to this night, to this life, to herself. "Thank you," she said to him, for the second time, and this time she knew what she was thanking him for. She was thanking him for seeing her when the world did not. She was thanking him for kneeling when pride and power and the entire tradition of his nature said he should not. She was thanking him for understanding, in the deep wordless intelligence that animals carried without apology, that some things needed to be witnessed before they could become real. Tempest breathed warm air against her face. Behind her, she heard the familiar rhythm of Caden's footsteps, and she felt the warmth of the bond reaching across the stable toward her, and she smiled in the lamplight and did not turn around yet, because she was still in this moment, this specific moment that was the last of one thing and the first of another, and she wanted to be completely present in it before she moved into whatever came next. She pressed her silver-marked wrist gently against the horse's dark nose. He breathed in. She breathed out. The night held them all in its enormous quiet, the king and the queen and the war horse that had started everything, and the stars outside the stable walls were the same stars that had been there for 22 years of her not knowing what she was, and they were beautiful, and they were permanent, and they were witnessing everything, and all of it was exactly, completely, irreversibly right. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who loves epic romance. Tell me in the comments, did you see this ending coming?